Hello. I'm reviewing books again. First book is called Today, Tonight, Tomorrow. I have the physical copy. Synopsis: it's about this high school girl named Rowan, and she has this rivalry with another guy named Neil, and they're competing for a bunch of like academic activity, like being student president and being like having the best grades and things like that. This entire book takes place within around 1 day, 1.5 days. They are competing in this competition where they're supposed to complete different objectives and be the first person to complete those objectives. I don't think I'm the right demographic for this book, just because it's very high school romance, very simple in terms of plot, in terms of motivation. Rowan, I think, was not a very interesting character. She always felt super flat to me. Like, her main problem in this book was the fact that the people around her didn't like romance novels. I feel like that problem was just so in comparison to all of the other characters, right? Rowan had the most uninteresting problem, right? If you look at Neil, he's got daddy issues, right? His dad is in jail. I think he has a masculine and femininity kind of problem as well. He is broke, he's from a low income family, all that stuff, right? Like, and he has a very interesting family dynamic. Like, Neil's situation and perspective was so much more interesting to me, right? At the end of the book, we get Neil's perspective on the scene that was the beginning of the book, right? And I feel like that chapter was way more interesting than anything Rowan had. Like, he had such a dynamic life, dynamic everything, right? Whereas Rowan is, she feels like a very spoiled girl, right? She's from like an upper middle income bracket. She has a very loving family. Her friends are extremely supportive of her, right? I think that was the most frustrating thing about this book, was that, like, why would you choose this main character as the person who drives the narrative? I guess like one aspect that the author was trying to go for was that Rowan and Neil are both Jewish, right? And there's like this scene in the book where it's implied essentially that all Jewish people are rich, right? And that is a bad stereotype, right? You know, if you think about and that's a problem, because you don't want to stereotype any large group of people. One other thing that I was found confusing about this book was the fact that, like, okay, so Rowan is Jewish, but she's also I think her mom is from Mexico, right? One of the things in the book that Rowan describes is she wants to be conversation with her family. She's learning Spanish, but then she drops Spanish, and she has this like Mexican background, right? I don't really understand. They talk about Judaism a lot in this book, and I just feel that if you introduce a character and you point out that this character is, in this case, right, like half Mexican, and talking about their Mexican identity, like that did not get a lot of attention in this book. It kind of feels, okay, in my opinion, right, it feels like the author was just trying to inject like a Mexican ethnicity into there. I think there's only one scene that I remember where Rowan's just describing how like her mom said was like muttered in Spanish when she was frustrated. One possible way to make Rowan a deeper character is to have like, this cultural conflict, right? Oh yeah, Rowan also, like, I think she messes up a lot in this book too. Like, with her friends, she's very absent because she's so driven by her need to win against Neil, and that drives away her friends. And in the end, her friends kind of just forgive her. Like, they just forgive her so easily, where they're just like, oh yeah, we know you're like that, right? I think there needed to be more tension between what Rowan could lose. Everything was in her head. Essentially, everything was in her head. And there is a argument to be made where it's like, oh, that was the point. Like, you're a teenager, and it feels like everything around you is crashing, even though it's not. Everything's in your head. But as a reader, it's so clear that these conflicts are just manufactured. As a reader, I got very annoyed by Rowan just by her she's just blindsided by everything. She is portrayed as like valedictorian, supposed to be very, like, at least academically smart, and even socially smart, right? She's in leadership positions. She is trying to organize a bunch of people, right? So you're assuming that she has a lot of these social cues and she understands what people are feeling. Like, I feel like this perspective is way too childish. It felt like I was reading like in the perspective of a middle school girl. I think Rowan has so much flaws, and the book never corrects her on those flaws, never severely punishes her on those flaws to help her grow. I think that's my main problem with this book. Alright, next book. Alright, next book we are going to discuss is Little Foxes Took Up Matches. It is about this boy named Mitya who's trying to grow up in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, And in this book, he goes on a journey of self-discovery about his queerness, gender, family relations, societal relations, expectations, masculinity, femininity, and a lot of cultural and social issues like that. I really enjoyed this book. I think its writing is very good. I think the topics it covers is very complex. I think Katya Kazbek does a very good job portraying everyone as very human. I'm surprised it's not as popular as I think it should be. It also has these wonderful kind of short stories that go along with the main story, and they just accompany so well with the main story, and they really put a new perspective on that main story. I'm going to talk about details of the book, so this is going to be a spoiler section for this book. So the first thing I want to talk about is Misha kind of first, he describes himself as a devchonka, which just means a girl in Russian, right? And throughout the book, it does seem like he wants to be portrayed as a girl throughout most of the book. But I notice, but when he like kind of goes out with Marina, for me, Marina kind of represents like the ally who has good intention, but maybe doesn't necessarily understand what, someone whose career might be going through. For example, right, when she first meets Mitya, she kind of automatically labels him as gay, and he kind of retorts in his mind that he doesn't really feel comfortable, or he doesn't really see himself as gay, or that he doesn't really know it, right? And I think that, Marina is well-intentioned, right? She's very accepting if he was gay, but I think the problem he's having is that he's going through this journey of like self-discovery and self-identity, right? He doesn't necessarily know what he is yet, right? I think that a lot of people are prone to anything that's not straight is automatically gay in the strictest sense of like male, in this case male, right? Male love. And I think that that definition, it's still very restricting for Mitya, right? And I don't think it plays a huge part in how he thinks about Marina, but it's still quite restricting, right? Because he doesn't know if he's gay, right? Or he doesn't know if he's gay in the purest sense of that word in the sense that it's just male and male, right? Even in the end of the book, when they're about to leave, and Marina says that, Marina says that she can introduce him to her family just as a, as a girl. He can always be a girl. He also feels uncomfortable with the idea. He's saying like, oh, I just want to kind of be fluid, right? Another thing I want to talk about was Mitya's relationship with the homeless man. His relationship with the homeless man, Valerka. So Valerka was this homeless man who immediately accepted Mitya for whoever he was, right? And he just dies by the military police. I think that Mitya's search for Valerka is kind of not only a search for justice, but also a search that the world is a good place. There is a semblance of good. And if there is a semblance of good in this world, then it's a world where he can exist. I think this book talks a lot also about how masculinity kind of destroys men a lot. He's being consistently restricted by masculine figures in his life, primarily his father, right? How does masculinity actually affect Mitya's father, right? Whose name is Dmitri. So Dmitri is kind of portrayed as this very ill-tempered man who's honestly not very smart, and is always looking to get a job, right? And he was originally a soldier, right? And he considers that the fact that he was a soldier a mark of pride, and shows that he is indeed a man, right? And so throughout the book, he clings on to that so hard. The fact that he was a soldier, that makes him a man. The fact that he's a soldier, that makes him a man, right? It's pretty clear to me that without that identification, he would be I think he would be lost in despair in the fact that he is pretty much a failure. There's this one scene in the book where at the end, a storm happens after when Misha is supposed to run away with Marina to go to her family, and Misha's father is just sitting at the table and he's crying. And he's crying because they're in this recession. They're just so broke. He can't get a job. He doesn't feel like he's doing anything right? And Misha tries to go over and comfort him, and he can't even accept that. He can't even accept that sense of comfort, because that's unmanly in his eyes, right? And it's so clear that his expectations of masculinity, of himself, is very self-destructive, and his expectation of Misha is also very destructive. So I think Dmitri is definitely a symbol of, toxic masculinity, but he is a version which has belittled the person so much that he kind of becomes, he's angry at the world, and he doesn't understand why. He doesn't understand how to change himself, right? I think Vovka is similar to Dmitri, except for the fact that he is completely destroyed and utterly demoralized by expectations of masculinity, right? He was in the war, he lost an arm. That's supposed to be a great honor, and it's supposed to be a very masculine thing, right? To lose an arm and to fight in your war for your country, right? But he goes back and he's just an utter scumbag who he literally cannot do anything. And it's kind of toppled on the fact that he might very possibly not be straight, right? And to him, that is a crisis. That is an internal crisis that he continuously fails to solve within himself, right? And because he can't solve it, he gets frustrated and he punishes Misha for it, right? You know, Vovka is a terrible person, right? But he's a terrible person that was crafted by this masculine power structure that forces him, that denies him the possibility of really looking into himself and perhaps finding some inner peace and acceptance of who he is. Vovka does attempt to change and become a better person, kind of gets suited up, gets a nice job, and Elisa Vatuyevna says that he will inevitably go back to his ways. And he does, right? After, I think it was New Year's, right? He gets drunk again and goes back to his ways even harder. I don't personally think that it's because it's what Alyssa said, where people don't change, they can't change. That is why he will go back to his ways. I think it's because the man he tried to become, this typical Russian straight man, his idealized version was something he can't maintain because that's not him, right? You're the best person you can be still has to be you, right? You can't be maintained by some facade. Okay, next book we're gonna talk about is the what the fuck was it called? The Royal Assassin. So this is gonna be book 2 of the Farsi trilogy. First book is the first book is The Assassin's Apprentice. Immediately there's gonna be spoilers for the first book at least, so watch out for that. Okay, so I mentioned before the first book is a slow burn. And I think that this book is also a slow burn as well. A lot of the action is political intrigue. It kind of tackles a lot of topics, including like, you know, loyalty, love, I don't know, time management. Overall, I think that if you like the first book, you would definitely like the second book. I think in terms of structure, they're very similar to each other. Alright, now we're gonna go to a spoiler section for this book. So I think this book is okay, I feel like in a lot of like movies and media where like the protagonist is kind of like vibing and killing it, and they're like kind of like the Spider-Man 3 Tobey Maguire kind of dancing through the streets, where they're like kind of living life on its absolute highest point. This book has that for Fit Chivalry, in a sense where every moment of his day is filled with something that's purposeful to him, till he slowly begins to lose everything that he's accumulated over the court. The main tension of this book is that you kind of know that he will lose all of these things, right? As a reader, you're seeing he's juggling way too much. He is trying to keep too much things together. He has conflicting ideas that he'll need to eventually choose, and that it's very obvious that will be the main conflict, right? So when he begins to lose Molly, because he chooses his king over his lover, and then he loses, you know, he loses both his, well, okay, he then loses king, he loses King Shrewd, and then he loses, you know, his freedom, and he loses his mind. I think that this fall from grace, it's, in this kind of sense structure, it's very similar to the first book, I would say, where I do think he had this kind of stride into the court where his day-to-day was more or less known. He was becoming more confident in the first book, and then Rigo comes, he goes to the mountains, and Rigo just absolutely demolishes his sense of self. And in the second book too, it's very much the same formula. I would say like maybe a criticism like I would have is just that it does sometimes feel like you understand everything that's gonna happen before it happens. And I think in this case it's not particularly a bad thing, because I think it's not meant to be a surprise. Really, like the signs are just very clearly there. I would say that, you know, it's very similar to this last book where there are things running amok where you understand larger things are happening, but because you're only in the perspective of Fitz Chivalry, you don't really understand the completion, like everything that's happening entirely. And so throughout the book, I think you more or less agree with Fitz Chivalry's decisions just because you're only privy to his knowledge, right? I think Verity in this book was more fleshed out as a character in terms of his flaws and his motivations and things like that. Katya in this book was a great character. She is honestly, in a lot of ways, Katya was the main character for me, because she is, you know, I could totally imagine this book where the perspective is Katya and she is just trying to navigate through the court and trying to gain her alliances, trying to gain power in her own way, as well as trying to, you know, establish a connection with her husband. In so much ways, she is so important to the story. And I will say, like, one of the things I do like about this book is that you get the sense that Fitzchivalry is not the most important character. He's not always the most important character. And, you know, throughout the book, he's called, like, the changer, the catalyzer, things like that. I do think this book does emphasize that fact where he kind of does things and forces the needle to move, right? But it is other characters who also act out to make sure that his moves have actual impact. I wish that Will as a character was more fleshed out in the second book. And maybe he'll be more fleshed out in the third book, but in the second book, because Will was kind of seen as this guy who is very quiet, not really a threat to anybody, and he suddenly is this major threat against Fitzchivalry, and it just seems like his main um, like the reason why he's an enemy is just because he's very insecure about himself and his station. I wish that he was portrayed as a much more complex character, just as a foil to Fitzchivalry, right? I think they would make great enemies that could have a lot of history and depth between them, but it does not seem like that's the direction that Robin Hobb is making. Maybe he'll be more complex in the next book. I think the addition of Nighthound or Nightwolf, okay, whatever, one of those two, right? I like Nighthound. He's good comedic relief at least. Anyways, I'm gonna read the third book. Okay, here's my prediction, right? I think that because the Fool in this book talks about how Fitz is the variable, which will lead to either stability or like chaos, like something to that effect, right? I think this book will show that Fitz causes chaos instead of stability. I think that's gonna be the main. I think that's gonna be the final ending of the third book. I think what happens is that he will destroy the Farseer line somehow, either by accident or on purpose, you know. Okay, that's it for this video. Bye bye.